Imagine you're sitting at a sun-drenched cafe in Split. The Adriatic Sea is sparkling, European vacationers are casually dropping €50 on a round of Aperol spritzes, and from the outside looking in, the country around you is an absolute economic powerhouse. The year is 2026. Croatia is currently flexing some of the highest GDP growth rates in the entire Eurozone. We're talking solid, resilient growth hovering around 3%, while traditional economic juggernauts like Germany are practically flatlining. The government is popping champagne over consecutive credit rating upgrades, and the country has seamlessly integrated into the Euro and Schengen zones. Sounds like a total utopia, right? Wrong. Because beneath the glossy tourism campaigns and the meticulously curated European Union spreadsheets, there is a creeping systemic time bomb. While the macroeconomic numbers look like a miracle, the reality on the ground is something much darker. Today, we are pulling back the curtain on the real truth about Croatia's economy. We're going to dismantle the hype and explain the actual mechanics behind this so-called boom. We're going to look at how a country can simultaneously get richer on paper while, statistically speaking, running out of its own citizens. We'll dive deep into the catastrophic brain drain, the dark side of a real estate market that has financially exiled an entire generation of locals, the incredibly addictive and dangerous trap of being Europe's favourite summer playground, and why importing tens of thousands of workers from across the globe is the only thing keeping the lights on. Welcome to the beautiful, highly profitable, and deeply paradoxical reality of the modern Croatian economy. Let's get into it. 1. The great demographic illusion. How to get richer by disappearing. Picture this. You're driving through Slavonia, the eastern agricultural heartland of Croatia. You pass through a village with beautiful Austro-Hungarian-style brick houses. The streets are clean, the internet connection is decent, and there's a freshly paved road, likely funded by a European Union cohesion grant. It's picturesque, it's serene, it's also completely empty. You look closer, and every third house has a naprodađu, for sale, sign fading in the sun. The local school has more teachers than students, and the only people you see at the local cafe are in their late 60s, nursing an espresso and talking to their grandchildren via WhatsApp video. Grandchildren who are currently living in Munich, Dublin or Graz. Now let's switch gears and look at the official financial reports coming out of Zagreb and Brussels. If you read the European Commission's forecasts or the IMF data for 2024 and 2025, Croatia looks like the undisputed economic champion of the region. While traditional heavyweights like Germany are sneezing and sputtering with 0-point-something growth, Croatia has been casually dropping GDP growth rates of 3.8% in 2024 and hovering around 3.1% to 3.2% in 2025. The sovereign credit rating has been bumped up to an A by Standard & Poor's. GDP per capita has surged past $26,000. To be fair, and let's build the strongest possible argument for the government here, this isn't entirely fake news. Integrating into the Eurozone and the Schengen area in 2023 was a massive logistical success. Croatia is absorbing billions in EU funds, specifically from the Recovery and Resilience Facility, which is genuinely driving government consumption and fixed investment. By all conventional macroeconomic metrics, the line on the graph is going up, and the people in charge are taking a well-deserved victory lap. But here is where we need to explain the actual mechanics of this miracle, rather than just swallowing the hype. How do you get a skyrocketing GDP per capita while the actual structural economy, the manufacturing base, the tech sector, the non-tourist exports, remains relatively anemic? Simple. You do the dark math. GDP per capita is a fraction. It's your total economic output, the numerator, divided by your total population, the denominator. Now, if you pump the numerator with billions of euros in free EU grants and an explosion of summer tourist spending, the top number goes up. But if you simultaneously shrink the denominator by losing hundreds of thousands of your own citizens, the result is a mathematical explosion in wealth per person. You aren't necessarily building a more productive, innovative society. You're literally getting richer on paper by disappearing. And the disappearance is staggering. Over the last decade, Croatia has lost nearly 400,000 residents. In a country that barely had 4.2 million people to begin with, that is catastrophic. The current population is estimated at around 3.86 million. Let those numbers provide the shock value for a second. Croatia has essentially deleted almost 10% of its total population. Imagine the United States losing 33 million people in 10 years, or the UK quietly misplacing 6.5 million citizens. Croatia is losing a town of about 15,000 inhabitants every single year, and the data shows this isn't just a random cross-section of society packing their bags. This is a highly targeted, aggressive brain drain. It is the young, the highly educated, the ambitious, and the fertile who are leaving. When Croatia joined the EU in 2013, the borders opened. The theory was that the free movement of labour would bring knowledge back and forth. The reality: it became a one-way conveyor belt of human capital straight into the waiting arms of Western Europe. Take the medical sector, for example. In recent years, data and digital demography tracking, like analysing Google Trends for German nursing job applications originating from Croatia, reveal a terrifying trend. Medical students at the University of Zagreb are practically graduating with a stethoscope in one hand and a one-way ticket to Stuttgart in the other. Projections suggest Croatia could lose up to a third of all its doctors over a 5-year window. Let's pause and appreciate the sheer dark irony of this economic model. The Croatian taxpayer foots the bill to educate these professionals. It costs the state tens of thousands of euros to put a student through medical school engineering programs or ET academies. The moment they become useful, productive, tax-paying adults, they take all that state-funded human capital and export it to Germany or Ireland for absolutely free. It is like spending your life savings restoring a classic vintage Porsche, paying for the premium, insurance, filling the tank with high-octane fuel, and then tossing the keys to your neighbour Hans because you don't have a driveway to park it in. The direct financial loss of this exported education is estimated to be over €1 billion. It is a massive, unrecorded subsidy from a poorer southern European country to the richest economies in the north. Why do they leave? Because despite the glowing GDP numbers, the reality on the ground is dominated by high living costs relative to local wages, pervasive nepotism in state-run sectors, and an economy heavily skewed toward pouring beers for tourists, rather than creating high-paying, value-added careers. If you are an aerospace engineer or a specialized surgeon, you simply cannot maximize your potential in an economy designed around a 3-month summer season. So, while the politicians point to the soaring GDP per capita and celebrate the economic boom, the reality is that the denominator of that equation is hollowing out. The country is rapidly becoming a high-income retirement home, financially propped up by European Union funds and remittances from the very youth who had to abandon it to make a living. But if all the young Croatians are leaving for Munich and Dublin, who's left to build the new EU-funded roads, serve the tourists, and keep the basic gears of the economy turning? Well, that leads us directly to the next deeply uncomfortable truth about the Croatian economic miracle. 2. The great import: how Nepal and the Philippines are building the new Croatia. Let's run another scenario. You're in an Airbnb in downtown Zagreb, it's raining, and you decide to order a pizza on Wolt or Glovo. 20 minutes later, there's a knock on the door. But the guy standing there handing you your capricciosa isn't a local university student named Marco trying to make some extra beer money. Marco isn't here. Marco is currently in Munich, assembling door panels for BMW. Instead, the guy handing you your pizza is Sunil. He is from Kathmandu, Nepal. He's wearing a bright blue delivery jacket, navigating a city where he barely speaks the language, and working a 12-hour shift to send remittances back to South Asia. If you walk past any major construction site in Split, look into the kitchens of the high-end seafood restaurants in Dubrovnik, or just observe the army of delivery bikes in Zagreb, you will notice a rapid, staggering demographic shift. Croatia, a country that has historically been one of the most culturally and ethnically homogeneous in Europe, is currently executing one of the most aggressive labour importation experiments on the continent. In a country with a population that has dipped below 3.9 million, the government issued over 206,000 work permits to foreign nationals in 2024 alone. By the end of 2025, that number continued to surge, with estimates showing hundreds of thousands of active foreign workers keeping the lights on. We are talking about importing a workforce equivalent to the population of Croatia's second-largest city, Split, every single year. Historically, when Croatia needed seasonal help, they just looked next door. They brought in workers from Bosnia and Herzegovina or Serbia, people who spoke essentially the same language, understood the culture, and blended right in. But that well has run dry. The Balkans are experiencing their own demographic collapse. so the recruitment agencies had to cast a wider net. Today, the leading source countries for Croatian work permits read like a map of the global south: Nepal, India, the Philippines, and Bangladesh. In fact, in early 2025, Nepalese workers actually began overtaking Bosnians as the largest single foreign workforce in the country. Now, let's acknowledge the strongest argument for why this is happening. Let's see the position of the Croatian government and the local business owners. They are not doing this out of some grand conspiratorial desire to replace the local population. They're doing this out of sheer, absolute economic panic. In 2025, the Croatian Chamber of Commerce reported a shortage of roughly 70,000 seasonal workers. If you own a boutique hotel on the Dalmatian coast, and you literally cannot find a local maid or a line cook because they have all emigrated to Ireland, what are you supposed to do? Close up shop and miss out on the lucrative summer tourist season? Default on your business loans? Stop building the EU-funded infrastructure projects because there's nobody to pour the concrete? Of course not. From a purely pragmatic survival standpoint, Croatian businesses must import labour. Without the Nepalese construction workers, the Indian delivery drivers, and the Filipino hospitality staff, the economic miracle we talked about in Part 1 would violently crash into a brick wall. The economy would quite literally cease to function. But while this is a necessary band-aid, we have to look at the underlying mechanics of why this cycle exists and what it is doing to the country's future. Under normal economic laws of supply and demand, if there is a severe labour shortage, wages are supposed to rise to attract workers. If a restaurant in Zadar can't find a waiter, they should have to increase the salary until the job becomes attractive enough for a local Croatian to take it. But by opening the floodgates to non-EU labour, that natural economic mechanism has been completely short-circuited. Why pay a local Croatian a competitive European standard living wage when an employment agency can fly in a worker from Bangladesh who will happily accept minimum wage? For a worker coming from a country where the average monthly salary might be $200, making €800 or €1,000 a month in Croatia feels like hitting the lottery. They will work grueling hours, live 8 to a room in cramped employer-provided bunkhouses, and rarely complain because the money they send home as remittances is life-changing for their families. The dark reality is that this creates a two-tiered society. At the top, you have the business owners and the property-holding class who are reaping the massive profits of the tourism and construction booms. At the bottom, you have an imported, easily exploitable underclass of gig workers and labourers who have few protections and are practically invisible in the social fabric of the country. And caught in the middle, the young working-class Croatians, they look at the job market, see that entry-level and blue-collar wages are being artificially suppressed by unlimited foreign labour, and realise they simply cannot afford the cost of living in their own country, especially when grocery prices in Croatia are often higher than in Germany, and rent is absolutely out of control. So, what do? They pack their bags and become the immigrant workforce in Munich or Dublin. It is an incredibly efficient, deeply depressing economic perpetual motion machine. Croatia exports its highly educated, state-funded youth to Western Europe and replaces them with cheap imported labour from Asia to serve the Western European tourists who come to visit. And speaking of not being able to afford to live in your own country, wait until you see what this economic boom has done to the real estate market. 3. The real estate paradox. Why 400,000 homes are empty while nobody can afford rent. Imagine it is May 31st. You're a 26-year-old Croatian graphic designer living in a modest 45 square metre apartment in the beautiful coastal city of Zadar. You pay your rent on time, you keep the place clean, and you water the landlord's ficus plant. But today, you are frantically shoving your clothes into garbage bags and loading them into your friend's battered Renault Clio. Why? Because tomorrow is June 1st. And on June 1st, the official tourist season begins. Your landlord, who has been perfectly pleasant all winter, has gently informed you that you need to be out by midnight because he is pivoting the apartment to Airbnb. For the next 4 months, your living room will be rented out to British stag parties and German backpackers for €150 a night. Congratulations, you're now officially a seasonal refugee in your own country. This isn't a rare dystopian anecdote. It is an annual, systemic migration. Every spring, thousands of local students and workers on the Dalmatian coast are effectively evicted so that property owners can cash in on the summer gold rush. They are forced to move back in with their parents inland, or couch surf until October when the tourists leave and the winter rentals open up again. Welcome to the Croatian real estate market, a sector of the economy so profoundly distorted that it defies standard economic logic. Let's look at the raw numbers, because they provide a shock value that needs no exaggeration. According to recent data synthesized from the National Census and state electricity provider records, tracking meters with zero consumption, Croatia currently has roughly 400,000 completely empty housing units. Let that sink in. In a country of 3.86 million people, nearly 500,000 apartments and houses are sitting there collecting dust. Under normal supply and demand mechanics, a massive surplus of empty homes should cause housing prices to absolutely crater. Supply is high, so prices should be low, right? Instead, the exact opposite has happened. The price per square metre in the capital, Zagreb, routinely breaches €3,500 to €4,000 for new builds. On the coast in places like Split or Dubrovnik, those numbers can easily double. Meanwhile, the median net salary in Croatia is hovering around €1,300 a month. Mathematically speaking, it is completely impossible for an average young Croatian professional to buy real estate without chaining themselves to a 30-year soul-crushing mortgage, and that's assuming the bank even approves them. So, how do we explain this paradox? How do you have skyrocketing prices alongside hundreds of thousands of empty ghost apartments? It comes down to three deeply flawed mechanics: the foreign capital flood, the ultimate government subsidy backfire, and the cultural addiction to bricks and mortar. First, let's look at the foreign capital flood. When Croatia officially adopted the euro on January 1st, 2023, the government celebrated. But do you know who celebrated even harder? Hans from Munich and Dieter from Vienna. Suddenly the currency risk was gone. If you are a middle-class Austrian or Slovenian looking for a safe place to park your savings to beat European inflation, buying a Seaview apartment in Istria or Kavarna is a no-brainer. The data clearly shows this. In recent years, upwards of 30% of all real estate transactions in Croatia were made by foreign nationals. And here is the kicker. A massive chunk of these transactions are done entirely in cash. When a local 20-something couple goes to the bank to beg for a €150,000 loan, they are bidding against a German retiree who's wiring €250,000 in liquid cash directly to the seller. The locals never stood a chance. The real estate market has essentially decoupled from the local economy. Houses aren't priced for people who work in Croatia. They are priced for people who vacation in Croatia. Quick pause here. If you're enjoying this breakdown of how economies actually work beneath the shiny PR campaigns, hit that subscribe button. Let me know in the comments which country's economy you want me to dissect next. It really helps the channel out. Okay, back to the housing crisis. Did they try to fix this? Yes, they did. And it was a spectacular textbook disaster. A few years ago, the government introduced the APN housing subsidy program. The idea sounded benevolent. To help young families buy homes, the state will step in and pay half of your mortgage installments for the first 5 years. If you have ever taken Econ 101, you already know the punchline. Let's explain the mechanics of induced demand. If a seller knows that the government just handed every buyer an extra €20,000 in purchasing power, what does the seller do? They immediately raise the asking price of their apartment by exactly €20,000. The APN subsidy didn't make housing more affordable. It simply transferred taxpayer money directly into the pockets of property developers and sellers, artificially inflating the bubble even further. Every time a new round of APN subsidies was announced, housing prices spiked. It was like trying to put out a grease fire by throwing a bucket of premium, unleaded gasoline on it. Finally, we have to talk about the local cultural mindset. In Croatia, there is a deep-seated, almost genetic distrust of the stock market, mutual funds, or complex financial instruments. This is a post-socialist country that survived hyperinflation in the 90s. If you tell a Croatian boomer to invest in an S&P 500 index fund, they will look at you like you just offered to sell them magic beans. To the average citizen, the only real wealth is concrete, bricks, soil. If a local actually manages to save up €100,000, they don't invest it in a tech startup. They buy a small second apartment. And because tenant protection laws are notoriously slow and legally messy to enforce, Many owners decide it is actually safer and more profitable to leave the apartment completely empty or just rent it to tourists for 60 days a year rather than deal with a long-term local tenant. This is the grim reality. The economic boom you see on paper is heavily driven by a rentier economy. We are looking at a society that is slowly transitioning from creating actual value and innovation to simply inheriting grandmother's Yugoslav-era apartment, slapping a coat of white paint and an IKEA lamp in it, and charging tourists €120 a night. Current trends suggest that if this dynamic doesn't shift, the concept of home ownership for the next generation of Croatians will be statistically eliminated. They are being financially exiled from their own neighbourhoods. But wait, if everyone is just renting out apartments to tourists, making cash hand over fist, how is the government funding itself? How do taxes work in a country where the biggest industry is essentially just the summer? Well, that brings us to the most wildly disproportionate tax system in the European Union. 4. The Zimmer Frei tax haven, why it pays to inherit but punishes to work. Imagine for a moment two completely different paths to financial independence in Croatia. Path A. You're a highly driven 28-year-old software engineer living in Zagreb. You spent 4 grueling years at the Faculty of Electrical Engineering and Computing, FER. You learned C++, Python and system architecture. You land a great job at a local tech firm with a gross salary of €3,000 a month. You're exactly the kind of high-value, innovative citizen a modern economy needs to survive the 21st century. But then, the end of the month arrives, and you receive your payslip. Before a single euro touches your bank account, the Croatian state swoops in. First, they take your mandatory pension contributions, Pillars 1 and 2. Then comes the health insurance contribution. Then comes the municipal income tax. By the time the dust settles, your €3,000 gross salary has been aggressively violently whittled down to a net take-home pay of around €1,900. The state just vaporized over a third of your labour value. And when you take that €1,900 to the supermarket to buy groceries, you are slapped with a 25% value-added tax, VAT, which remains one of the highest base consumption taxes in the entire European Union. Now let's look at Path B. Meet your cousin, Mate. Mate lives in the coastal city of Split. Mate did not go to engineering school. In fact, Mate hasn't updated his resume since 2018. However, Mate has one supreme, unbeatable economic advantage. He inherited his grandmother's 80-square-metre apartment, located a convenient 10-minute walk from Diocletian's palace. Mate puts a classic Zimmer Frei, rooms for rent, sign in the window, or rather, he lists the apartment on Airbnb and Booking.com. During the 100-day peak summer season, he charges British tourists and German backpackers €150 to €200 a night. By October, Mate has grossed a very comfortable €15,000 to €20,000 in pure liquid cash. So how much does the state take from Mate's €20,000 windfall? Is he taxed at the same aggressive rate as your software engineering salary? Not even close. Welcome to the wildest, most disproportionate tax paradox in Europe. For years, the Croatian tax code practically operated as a Caribbean offshore tax haven for private tourist rentals, while treating actual value-creating labour like a Nordic socialist democracy. Historically, private renters like Mate paid what is known as a paušalni porez, a lump sum flat tax. It was calculated not by how much money you made, but by how many physical beds you had in the apartment. And the rate was comically low, often hovering between €20 to €40 per bed per year. That meant if Mate had 4 beds, his total annual income tax on his €20,000 summer business could mathematically be as low as €160. That is an effective tax rate of less than 1%. Now let's apply the anti-propaganda rule and still man the government side of the story. Has the government recognised that this is a grossly unfair, structurally damaging system? Yes. In fact, if you read the financial news entering 2025, the government proudly announced a massive sweeping tax reform specifically targeting this exact problem. In 2025, they finally introduced a mandatory real estate tax, porez na nekretnin, to replace the old, easily bypassed vacation home tax. The goal was to heavily tax empty properties and short-term rentals to force owners to put them on the long-term market for locals. Furthermore, they raised the brackets for the flat-rate tourist bed tax tying it to a tourism development index. The political spin was clear. The free ride is over. The wealthy landlords are finally going to pay their fair share. But let's strip away the PR hype and look at the actual math, because the facts provide all the dark humour we need. Under this new 2025 crackdown, local municipalities are allowed to set the new real estate tax anywhere from 60 cents to a maximum of €8 per square metre. Let's assume the city of Split decides to absolutely hammer your cousin mate with the maximum legal penalty of €8 per square metre. For his 80 square metre apartment, that equals €640 a year. Let's add the newly increased flat rate bed tax, which for a top-tier tourist destination might max out around €150 to €300 per bed. We'll say he pays another €800 for his 4 beds. Mate's total tax burden under the brand new aggressive government crackdown is roughly €1,440. On a €20,000 seasonal income, his effective tax rate has skyrocketed all the way to about 7%. Meanwhile, our software engineer in Zagreb is still bleeding out well over €10,000 a year in various income taxes and mandatory social contributions, simply for having the audacity to work a full-time, highly skilled job. This is the hidden mechanic of Croatia's economic reality. It is a rentier economy disguised as a modern European state. The system actively, mathematically punishes innovation, hard labour and intellectual development, while heavily rewarding the passive ownership of concrete. The psychological and societal impact of this tax discrepancy cannot be overstated. When a government taxes wages at European levels, but taxes real estate wealth at nearly zero, it sends a crystal clear, incredibly dangerous message to its own youth. Do not study, do not build a startup, do not try to invent the next big app or medical device. The highest return on investment in this country is to wait for your grandparents to pass away, slap a coat of white paint over the Yugoslav-era wallpaper, buy an IKEA lamp, and wash bedsheets for tourists from Munich. And this isn't just a cynical joke, it is showing up in the macro data. The capital allocation in the country is deeply distorted. Instead of local entrepreneurs investing their surplus cash into tech companies, green energy, or manufacturing, sectors that actually create high-paying jobs and long-term economic resilience, they pour every single spare euro into buying more coastal apartments to rent out. The money is literally trapped in bricks. It is an incredibly fragile economic model. You are effectively putting the entire country's GDP on the roulette table, betting it all on sunny weather in July, and hoping that a global pandemic, a localized geopolitical crisis, or an unexpected shift in European travel trends doesn't suddenly keep the tourists at home. Because if the tourists stop coming, the entire house of cards collapses. Which brings us to the ultimate terrifying vulnerability of the Croatian miracle, the country's fatal addiction to the sun. 5. The Dutch disease, sunburn edition, why a 20% GDP monoculture is a ticking time bomb. Imagine you are a brilliant, ambitious entrepreneur living in the coastal city of Šibenik. You have a fantastic idea for a light manufacturing company that produces high-tech components for electric bicycles. You have the blueprints, you have the drive, and you go to the local bank to ask for a €500,000 commercial loan to build a small factory and hire 20 skilled workers. The loan officer looks at your meticulously crafted 40-page business plan, smiles sympathetically and says, "This is incredibly innovative, but have you considered just building 6 luxury villas with infinity pools instead? We can approve that loan in about 45 minutes. You leave the bank empty-handed. You try to hire a local operations manager anyway, but you quickly realize you can't afford them, because a decent manager can make 3 times as much money managing a fleet of tourist sailboats for 4 months and then spending the rest of the year playing paddle. Welcome to the mechanics of the Dutch disease, sunburn edition. In economics, the Dutch disease is a phenomenon where the rapid development of one specific sector, traditionally natural resources like oil or gas, causes a massive influx of foreign currency. This influx drives up local prices and wages, which effectively chokes out and kills every other export-driven sector in the economy, like manufacturing or technology, because they can no longer compete. Croatia doesn't have massive offshore oil rigs, but it does have the Adriatic Sea, and economically speaking, it functions exactly the same way. Let the data provide the shock value. Depending on how you measure the indirect spillover effects, tourism accounts for roughly 19% to 20% of Croatia's total gross domestic product. That is the highest dependency on tourism of any country in the European Union. By comparison, Spain and Italy, countries globally famous for their tourist sectors, hover around the 10% to 12% mark. Croatia welcomes roughly 20 million tourists a year. That is more than 5 times its own population crossing the borders to spend money. Let's acknowledge the absolute miracle of the Croatian coast. After the devastating homeland war in the 1990s, Croatia's industrial base was largely in ruins. The country needed hard foreign currency, and it needed it fast. Tourism was the ultimate lifeline. It funded the rebuilding of the nation. It financed the spectacular world-class highway system that connects the north to the south. It is practically a geographic superpower. The Dalmatian coast is objectively one of the most stunning archipelagos on planet Earth. When you have a natural comparative advantage like that, you exploit it. It would be economic malpractice not to. But there is a fatal difference between leveraging a comparative advantage and developing a life-threatening addiction. And Croatia has crossed that line into pure economic monoculture. When an economy relies this heavily on a single, highly volatile sector, it structurally breaks the mechanics of capital and labour allocation. Money is fundamentally lazy. It seeks the path of least resistance and highest return. In Croatia, why would an investor risk millions trying to compete with German engineering or American software when they can just pour concrete near the beach and guarantee a 10% annual yield from vacationing Austrians? This creates a vicious cycle. The tourism sector absorbs all the available investment capital. It absorbs all the available local labour. Because it absorbs the labour, the cost of hiring goes up. Because the cost of hiring goes up, non-tourism businesses, like a hypothetical e-bike factory, are squeezed to death. The result? The country essentially stops producing exportable physical goods and high-value intellectual property, becoming totally reliant on importing everything from foreign countries paid for by the euros dropped by tourists in July and August. Quick check-in. Have you ever lived in a city that felt like it was totally hollowed out by tourism? Let me know in the comments what your local economy relies on. Let's see who has the most fragile monoculture. This brings us to the terrifying structural fragility of this model. When you run an economy where 20% of your GDP is based entirely on the premise of people voluntarily getting on airplanes and driving across borders to relax, you're exposing your sovereign nation to catastrophic external risks over which you have absolutely zero control. Let's look at 3 highly probable threat vectors that haunt the nightmares of the Croatian Ministry of Finance. Risk vector 1, the German sneezes. Croatia's #1 source of tourists is Germany. Currently, the German economy is, to put it mildly, struggling. They are facing deindustrialization, high energy costs, and flirting with technical recessions. If Hans from Stuttgart loses his middle management job at a chemical plant, the very first thing he cuts from his family budget is the €4,000 summer trip to a villa in Var. Current macroeconomic trends suggest that a prolonged slump in Central Europe will act like a direct vacuum on Croatian GDP. If your biggest customer goes broke, your cash flow dies. Risk vector 2, the black swan. We don't even need to use economic theory for this one. We just have to look at the year 2020. When global supply chains seized up and travel stopped due to the pandemic, Croatia's GDP didn't just dip, it cratered by over 8.5%. It was one of the sharpest contractions in Europe. A tourism monoculture means any global shock, a pandemic, an ash cloud from a volcano, or geopolitical instability in neighbouring regions can instantly wipe out a fifth of the country's economic output overnight. Risk vector 3, the climate thermostat. This is the one nobody in the local real estate market wants to talk about. The data indicates that Mediterranean summers are getting aggressively, dangerously hotter. We're seeing sustained heat waves pushing 40 degrees Celsius, 104 degrees Fahrenheit, and massive wildfires becoming the norm. The mechanics of tourism are heavily tied to comfort. If July and August in Dalmatia consistently become too dangerously hot for a family to safely walk outside, probabilistic modelling suggests a massive shift in European travel habits. Tourists might start migrating north, seeking out the beaches of Poland, the Baltic states, or Scandinavia for their summer holidays. If the climate shifts the sweet spot for Mediterranean tourism into April and October, the massive infrastructure built specifically for the July/August peak will face a severe profitability crisis. In short, The Croatian economic miracle is currently balanced on the edge of a knife. It is a highly profitable, beautiful machine, but it lacks a shock absorber. But surely, you might say, the people running the country see this coming, right? Surely the state apparatus, armed with EU cohesion funds and modern governance, is actively working to diversify the economy and root out inefficiencies? Well, to answer that, we have to look at the entity that employs more people than the entire tourism sector, combined. We need to talk about the bloated, immovable, and incredibly expensive Leviathan sitting in the room. 6. The Leviathan, how to employ everyone and accomplish nothing. Imagine you're back to being that ambitious entrepreneur. Let's say you've abandoned the high-tech e-bike factory because you couldn't get the loan, and you've decided to play the game. You're going to open a simple, picturesque beachside cafe. All you need is a permit to put 5 tables on the public sidewalk. You walk into the local municipal building. The air smells faintly of stale cigarette smoke and cheap coffee. You approach counter number 3. Behind the glass sits a woman who looks incredibly annoyed by your mere existence. You hand her your application. She looks at it, sighs deeply, and informs you that you are missing Form 8B, which needs a blue stamp, not a red stamp. Where do you get the blue stamp? Office 412. You go to Office 412. The door is locked. A handwritten note taped to the wood says, "Pausa," on break. It is 10:30 a.m. They will be back at 11:30 a.m., but unfortunately they stop, working with clients at 11:45 a.m. Come back tomorrow. Welcome to the beating bureaucratic heart of the Croatian economy. Welcome to the domain of the Uljeb. To understand the real truth about Croatia's economy, you have to understand this uniquely Croatian term. Uljeb, pronounced Uljeb, literally translates to "in the bread." It refers to a person who has secured a comfortable, practically unfireable job within the state bureaucracy or a state-owned enterprise, usually through political connections, nepotism, or family ties, rather than actual merit. They are the ultimate beneficiaries of the state apparatus, and statistically speaking, they make up a terrifyingly large portion of the workforce. Let the numbers provide the shock value here. Croatia, as we established, has a population of less than 3.9 million people. That is roughly the population of the city of Los Angeles. Now, if you were managing a population the size of one American city, how many local governments would you need? Maybe a mayor, a city council, and a few district managers, right? The Republic of Croatia is carved up into 20 counties, 127 cities, and 428 municipalities. That is a total of 575 distinct local government units, and mechanics dictate that every single one of those 575 units needs a mayor or a municipal head. They need a deputy, they need a local council, they need a secretary, a legal department, a financial director, an official car, an official driver, and a cousin who runs the heavily subsidised local tourist board. There are municipalities in Croatia with fewer than 1,000 actual residents that somehow maintain a full, salaried bureaucratic staff. It is a Kafkaesque labyrinth of redundant paperwork, overlapping jurisdictions, and phantom employees whose primary job description consists of playing solitaire and stamping pieces of paper. Why did the government build this Leviathan? Was it just pure cartoonish corruption? Not exactly. It was a survival mechanism. In the 1990s, Croatia transitioned violently from a socialist planned economy to a free market capitalist system, all while fighting a brutal war for independence. When the dust settled, hundreds of massive, inefficient state-run factories from the Yugoslav era were shut down or controversially privatized. Suddenly, you had hundreds of thousands of working-class people with no jobs, no prospects, and a lot of post-war trauma. The state stepped in. To prevent mass poverty, civil unrest, and sheer economic collapse, the ruling political parties essentially used the public sector as a gigantic, disguised welfare program. They created counties and municipalities out of thin air to give people jobs. They brought social peace by putting people in the bread. And in return, those people, and their extended families, became a highly reliable, guaranteed voting base that keeps the ruling parties in power decade after decade. It is a highly rational, mutually beneficial transaction if you are a politician or an Uljeb. But fast forward to 2026 and this system is structurally suffocating the country. Remember our software engineer from part 4? The one losing over a third of their salary to taxes and paying a 25% VAT on groceries. This is why their taxes are so high. The government physically cannot lower income taxes or consumption taxes because every single month, this massive, unproductive, unfireable bureaucratic Leviathan needs to be fed. The ratio is economically brutal. In a healthy modern economy, you want a vast, thriving private sector generating wealth, which comfortably supports a lean, efficient public sector and the retired population. In Croatia, the cart is heavier than the donkey pulling it. When you add up the pensioners, over 1.2 million people, and the bloated public sector/state enterprise workers, hundreds of thousands more, you realise that a relatively small, highly taxed core of private sector workers is carrying the entire financial weight of the nation on its back. This creates a massive drag on foreign investment. If a global tech company wants to open a massive headquarters in Eastern Europe, they look at Croatia's tax rates. They look at the glacial, politically motivated judicial system. They look at the 428 municipalities they might have to bribe or beg for permits, and they politely turn around and build their headquarters in Romania or Poland instead. So, to summarise the mechanics of the machine so far, we have a demographic collapse artificially padded by imported labour. We have a real estate market built for foreign cash that financially exiles the youth. We have a tax system that rewards inheriting concrete and punishes innovation. We have a 20% GDP monoculture addicted to the summer sun. And all of this is being dragged down by an impossibly heavy, politically protected bureaucracy. It sounds bleak, but the government still has one massive shining counter-argument to all of this: the euro. Joining the Eurozone was supposed to be the ultimate shield. It was supposed to bring European stability, lower interest rates, and protect the pockets of the average citizen from global volatility. But as we're about to see, the introduction of the euro didn't just fail to protect the local consumer, it accidentally helped trigger a cost of living crisis that is fundamentally altering the Croatian way of life. Let's talk about the grocery store shock. 7. The euro illusion: why a German grocery bill hurts twice as much in Zagreb. Imagine it's a random Tuesday evening in 2026. You just clocked out of work and you stop by the local Konzum or Spar supermarket in Zagreb to grab a few basic essentials. You aren't buying caviar or truffle oil, you grab a block of butter, a pack of chicken breasts, a bottle of decent local olive oil, some eggs, a loaf of bread, and a standard stick of deodorant. The cashier scans the items. You tap your card. The total is 38 euros. You walk out of the store and a chilling realization washes over you. If you were to take that exact same basket of goods and scan it at a supermarket in Munich, Germany or Milan, Italy, the bill would likely be exactly the same. In fact, if you go to a drugstore chain like DM or Müller, the German receipt for those exact same toiletries might actually be cheaper than the Croatian one. But here is where the math becomes violent. The median net wage in Germany is hovering around 2,800 euros. The median net wage in Croatia is around 1,300 euros. You are paying first world, premium European prices on a Balkan salary. Welcome to the grocery store shock and the deeply painful reality of Croatia's integration into the Eurozone. To understand how a country can completely break its own citizens' purchasing power in record time, we have to look at the mechanics of the currency swap, the psychological fog of war, and the corporate mastery of greedflation. Now, per the rules of objective analysis, we must first steelman the euro. From a macroeconomic sovereign state level, adopting the euro on January 1st, 2023 was a massive, undeniable triumph. Before the euro, Croatia used the kuna, which was essentially pegged to the euro anyway. By officially adopting the currency, the government permanently eliminated currency exchange risk. They stabilised the banking sector. They lowered the cost of borrowing for the state, which is exactly why the credit rating. Agencies popped champagne and upgraded Croatia to an A rating. For exporters and the government, the euro is a shield of armour, but for the average citizen on the ground, the euro transition acted as a massive psychological smoke grenade that allowed the retail and hospitality sectors to execute one of the greatest wealth transfers in modern national history. Let's explain the mechanics of how this actually happened. When the euro was introduced, the official conversion rate was permanently fixed at 7.53450 kuna to €1. If you are a human being, doing advanced division by 7.53 in your head while standing in line at a bakery is practically impossible. Your brain loses its internal anchor for what things should cost. Retailers, distributors, and cafe owners understood this psychological vulnerability perfectly. They also had the perfect alibi. global inflation and supply chain disruptions. So, they engaged in a practice called rounding up, but on steroids. Let's look at the cornerstone of the entire Croatian social fabric, the cup of coffee. Before the euro, a standard espresso with milk at a neighbourhood cafe might have cost 12 kuna. Mathematically, that is €1.59. But when the menus were reprinted, the cafe owners didn't list the coffee at €1.59. They didn't even list it at €1.80. They looked at the menu, shrugged, and printed €2.50. Why? Because to a tourist, €2.50 still sounds perfectly reasonable. But for the local, that is an overnight, unannounced 50% price hike. This happened across the entire board. Haircuts went from 60 kuna, €8, to €15. A basic slice of pizza jumped by 40%. The supermarkets blamed the distributors blamed the farmers blamed the energy costs, and the consumer was left holding a violently inflated bag. Even when global energy prices stabilised and European inflation data started to cool down, the prices in Croatian supermarkets categorically refused to drop. Why would they? The retail market in Croatia is highly concentrated among a few massive corporate players. If nobody lowers their prices, the consumer has no choice but to pay. It's classic inelastic demand. You have to eat. Quick check. Go to the comments right now and tell me how much a standard cappuccino and a dozen eggs cost in your local grocery store and what country you're in. The data comparisons are always mind-blowing. Let's see who is getting scammed the hardest. The government, watching their voters get completely financially squeezed, panicked. They rolled out aggressive, highly publicised interventions. They created a government whitelist tracking application so citizens could see which supermarkets were price gouging. They legally froze the prices of basic goods like minced meat, sunflower oil and milk. But if you know anything about the mechanics of price controls, you know they are a political band-aid that almost always backfires. When you force a supermarket to sell a litre of oil at a fixed loss, they simply pass that loss on to unregulated items. Sure, your basic cooking oil is cheap, but suddenly a bottle of generic shampoo costs €6 and a bag of potato chips is €4. Or, the producers engage in shrinkflation. The price stays the same, but that 100-gram chocolate bar is now suspiciously 80 grams. The data indicates that this cost of living crisis is permanently altering the cultural DNA of the country. In Croatia, sitting at a cafe for 2 hours is not just a leisure activity. It is the national therapy session, the primary networking event, and the cornerstone of social cohesion. Pricing the working class out of their daily coffee or making a family dinner at a local restaurant a luxury reserved only for birthdays and anniversaries breeds a deep structural resentment. It reinforces the narrative we discussed in part 1. When a 25-year-old nurse looks at her €1,100 paycheck, looks at the €800 rent for a basic apartment, and realises she has to skip meals to afford decent winter boots, the decision to emigrate to Germany is no longer about ambition. It becomes an equation of pure mathematical survival. The economic indicators from Brussels might say Croatia is a wealthy, thriving Eurozone success story. But down in the aisles of the grocery store, the reality is that the local population is being systematically priced out of its own country. But wait, if everything is so expensive and the youth are leaving and the tourism sector is a ticking time bomb, how is the entire country not bankrupt? Who is actually paying to keep the roads paved, the hospitals open, and the Leviathan bureaucracy fed? Well, prepare yourself, because we are about to look at the ultimate life support machine. We need to talk about the addiction to free money. 8. The free money, IV drip, how Brussels became the ultimate sugar daddy. Imagine you are playing a video game. Let's say SimCity or Cities, Skylines. You're the mayor and your city is struggling. Revenues are down, your citizens are complaining about potholes, and your budget is in the red. But then you discover a cheat code. Every time you type this code into the console, a massive, unpayable sum of gold just magically drops into your city's treasury. Suddenly, you are building state-of-the-art hospitals, glittering suspension bridges, and a brand new fleet of electric buses. Your approval ratings skyrocket. You look like the greatest mayor in the history of the game. But what happens when the game developers release a patch and the cheat code stops working? Welcome to the macroeconomic reality of the Republic of Croatia in 2026. To understand how the Croatian government is managing to survive the demographic collapse, the real estate crisis, and the suffocating weight of its own bureaucracy, we have to look at the ultimate financial life support machine, European Union Cohesion and Recovery Funds. Let the numbers provide the shock value here. For the past decade, Croatia has been one of the largest net beneficiaries of EU funds relative to its GDP. That means for every single euro the Croatian taxpayer sends to the EU budget in Brussels, they get roughly 3 to 4 euros back in the form of grants and subsidies. And then came the pandemic, and the EU unlocked the ultimate cheat code, the Next Generation EU Recovery Fund, the RRF. Billions upon billions of euros were allocated to Croatia. By some estimates, during the peak absorption years of 2024 and 2025, EU funds were mathematically responsible for almost all of the country's public investment. Let me repeat that, because the mechanics of it are staggering. If you remove European Union money from the equation, the Croatian government's actual self-funded capital investment drops to practically zero. The physical results of this money are absolutely spectacular, and they have genuinely modernised the country. If you drive down the Dalmatian coast, you will eventually cross the Pelješac Bridge. It is a breathtaking 2.4-kilometre long architectural marvel that finally connected the southernmost part of Croatia, Dubrovnik, to the rest of the country, bypassing the Bosnian border. It is a symbol of national pride. It cost over 500 million euros to build, but Croatia didn't pay for it. The European Union covered 85% of the cost. Everywhere you look, there are blue signs with a ring of yellow stars proudly announcing, co-financed by the European Union. They are on new university buildings in Osijek, on water treatment plants in Istria, on modern tram lines in Zagreb, and on rural broadband internet projects in Slavonia. This money has objectively raised the standard of living, improved infrastructure, and provided a massive, undeniable cushion against global economic shocks. But let's put away the PR brochures and look at the dark underlying mechanics of this free money IV drip. Because structurally speaking, it is masking a terrifying level of economic stagnation and enabling the worst habits of the political class. First, let's talk about the mechanic of political complacency. Remember the 428 municipalities and the bloated old bureaucracy we discussed in Part 6, and the deeply broken innovation-punishing tax code from Part 4? In a normal enclosed economy, a government with a shrinking tax base and a massive public payroll would be forced by the sheer laws of mathematics to implement deep, painful structural reforms. They would have to fire redundant bureaucrats. They would have to slash red tape to attract foreign factories. They would have to actually incentivize their citizens to start businesses to generate tax revenue. But why on earth would a Croatian politician commit political suicide by firing 50,000 redundant public workers to save €1 billion when they can simply hire a team of consultants to fill out a 400-page PDF, submit it to the European Commission, and have Brussels wire them €2 billion for digital transition and green energy? The EU funds act as a massive financial anaesthetic. They allow the state to completely ignore the systemic cancer in its own economy because the pain is masked by an endless stream of foreign cash. The government can point to the EU-funded cranes on the skyline, boast about the 3% GDP growth, and pretend that the system is working perfectly. Quick pause. Does your local government rely heavily on federal or supranational bailouts to build basic infrastructure? Sound off in the comments. I want to know if this is a uniquely Balkan phenomenon or a global one. Second, we have to look at the circular economy of EU funds. Where does this money actually go once it enters the Croatian banking system? Let's use a hypothetical €100 million EU grant to build a new railway segment. The Croatian government receives the money. Great. But Croatia's heavy construction industry was largely hollowed out years ago, so the government puts out a public tender, and a massive Austrian, Turkish or Chinese construction conglomerate wins the bid. That foreign conglomerate brings in its own management. They buy the high-tech drilling equipment and heavy machinery from Germany or Italy. To actually pour the concrete and lay the tracks, they don't hire locals, because the locals are in Ireland, remember? So they import 500 labourers from Nepal and Bangladesh through temporary work agencies. Do you see the mechanic here? The European Union wires €100 million to Zagreb. Zagreb pays a Turkish company, who buys German machines, and pays Nepalese workers, who send their wages back to Kathmandu as remittances. The money briefly touches the Croatian GDP spreadsheet, creating the beautiful illusion of economic growth, and then immediately violently ricochets right back out of the country. The physical railway is left behind, which is great, but the actual wealth creation, the skill building, and the long-term capital accumulation do not stay in the local economy. And finally, we arrive at the most terrifying variable in this entire equation, the fiscal cliff of 2026. The massive next-generation EU recovery fund was not a permanent fixture. It was an emergency post-pandemic mechanism with a strict, legally binding expiration date, the end of 2026. For the past 3 years, the Croatian government has been in a mad, frenzied dash to absorb and spend every single cent of this allocation before the clock runs out. This frantic spending spree is precisely what artificially inflated the GDP growth numbers that look so good on paper today. But current macroeconomic models suggest a sobering reality for the morning after. What happens in 2027? When the RRF funds evaporate, the baseline EU cohesion funds will still exist, but the total volume of free money flowing into the country will drop off a cliff. When public investment inevitably crashes, the construction sector will contract. When the construction sector contracts, the GDP growth rate will plummet, and when the tide of EU money finally recedes, the Republic of Croatia will be left standing naked on the beach. They will no longer be able to hide behind Brussels' checkbook. They will be forced to look at their own domestic economy, an economy overwhelmingly reliant on summer sunshine, staffed by imported labour, burdened by an immovable bureaucracy, and missing 400,000 of its own brightest young minds. Which brings us to the ultimate question. Is this a story of a country doomed to fail, or is there a way out of this beautifully constructed trap? Let's wrap this up and look at the final verdict. 9. Final thoughts. The velvet trap. Growth versus development. Let's take a deep breath. I know we just spent the last 20-something minutes completely dismantling the shiny, PR-approved narrative of one of Europe's most beautiful countries. If you're a Croatian citizen watching this, you might be feeling a mix of validation and deep existential dread. If you're a tourist who just booked a 2-week sailing trip to Split, you might be looking at your itinerary with a sudden, overwhelming sense of guilt. Don't cancel your trip, by the way. The food is incredible, the sea is pristine, and ironically, they desperately need your euros to keep the lights on. But what is the ultimate takeaway here? What is the real truth about the Croatian economy when we strip away the tourism brochures and the European Commission's GDP spreadsheets? The truth is that the Croatian economic machine is not broken. Read that again. It isn't broken. It is actually functioning exactly as it is, currently designed to function. The problem is that it is designed to operate as a rentier state. It is a highly efficient mechanism for extracting wealth from foreign tourists and European taxpayers, and funneling it directly into the pockets of the property-owning class and a politically protected bureaucracy. It works perfectly for the hotel owner, the Uljeb in the municipal office, and the foreign investor buying up coastline. But it mathematically fails the 25-year-old software engineer, the local nurse, and the aspiring entrepreneur. This brings us to the most important economic lesson of this entire video, the critical life-or-death difference between economic growth and economic development. Croatia has economic growth. The line on the graph is going up. GDP is expanding because billions of euros are being pumped into the system from Brussels, and millions of tourists are spending cash on the coast. But Croatia is severely lacking in economic development. Development means you're increasing the technological complexity of your society. It means you're building high-value industries, keeping your brightest minds at home, patenting new technologies, and creating a resilient middle class that creates wealth through innovation, not just location. A country can experience massive economic growth while fundamentally hollowing itself out. If you sell off all your natural resources, export your highly educated youth, import cheap, exploitable labour, and rely on foreign subsidies to build your roads, you will look incredibly rich on paper. But current macroeconomic trends suggest that this is a velvet trap. Once the European Union recovery funds expire at the end of 2026, and if the global climate shifts or the German economy enters a prolonged recession, the velvet trap snaps shut. A nation cannot sustain itself purely as a sunny, highly subsidized retirement community and theme park for wealthier Northern Europeans. At some point you have to actually make something. There is a profound warning here, not just for Croatia, but for Portugal, Spain, Greece, and any other nation currently flirting with the idea of trading its industrial and innovative capacity for the easy, addictive cash of mass tourism and real estate speculation. The data indicates a clear crossroad. Croatia has all the raw ingredients to be a genuine powerhouse. It has brilliant minds. Just look at companies like Rimac Automobili, a Croatian startup that literally took over Bugatti and is building the world's fastest electric hypercars right outside of Zagreb. That proves the genius is there. The geographical positioning is flawless. The safety and lifestyle are world-class. But unless there is a radical structural shift to dismantle the bureaucratic Leviathan, aggressively tax empty real estate to free up housing, and dramatically lower the tax burden on human labour and innovation, the math simply won't let that potential be realised on a national scale. If you made it this far into the video, you clearly appreciate looking past the headlines and understanding the actual mechanics of how the world works. If you learned something today, or if this changed the way you look at European economics, please hit that subscribe button. It tells the algorithm that there is an audience for deep, heavily researched, objective dives into global finance, and it allows me to keep making these for you. I want to hear from you in the comments. Does your country suffer from the Dutch disease of tourism? Are you dealing with a massive gap between local wages and globalized real estate prices? Drop a comment below and let me know which country's economic illusion I should dismantle next. If you want to understand how another massive global economy is quietly hiding a terrifying structural crisis, click on the playlist on your screen right now where, in one of the videos, I break down the absolute madness of the Canadian real estate bubble. The mechanics there will blow your mind. Thank you so much for watching. Stay curious, look at the denominators, and I'll see you in the next one.